Here we will see parallel for loop in C sharp. If we use a standard for loop in C sharp to iterate a block of code, then the execution of this code will be done sequentially. That is, if we want to print first 10 numbers using for loop, it will print numbers from 1 to 10 sequentially because our for loop executes sequentially. From the first one, that is, first number will be 1 and the last number will be 10. If we want to execute the different iterations of this block of code simultaneously, then we will use parallel for loop. In C sharp, the parallel for loop is a part of the task parallel library and it is used to parallelizing loops. It executes iteration of a loop in parallel on multiple threads, which improves performance by utilizing multiple processors or cores more effectively. This approach is especially beneficial when you are executing CPU bound operations. Here the iterations are independent of each other. That is, subsequent iteration do not need the state updates made by the previous iteration. In such cases, we must use task parallel library to run each iteration in parallel on all the available cores. Difference between for and parallel for loop is, in case of the standard C sharp for loop, the loop will run using a single thread, and in case of parallel for loop, the loop will execute using multiple threads. And in case of standard for loop, the loop is iterated in sequential order, whereas in case of parallel for loop, the order of iteration is not going to be in sequential order. We will define basic for loop as for int I equal to 0, I less than n and I plus plus, and will execute the statements. Whereas with parallel for loop, we will use parallel.for, then starting number, ending number. Here we will use delegates, so I equal to lambda, and we will execute the statements. Now we will try to execute this in Visual Studio. So first we will use basic for loop. So we will write here console.writeLine basic for loop, and we will use for. So for int I equal to 1, I less than or equal to 10 and I plus plus, we will print I. So with console.writeLine, we will print I, and then we will use parallel for loop. So in console.writeLine, we will write parallel for loop, and here we will use parallel for loop. So parallel dot for, here we will use starting value as 1. Here it will display parameters with this parallel dot for. So first value is inclusive, comma 10, that is second value which is exclusive, and we'll use I as a variable, and we'll use lambda here, and then we'll write the statement as console.writeLine I, and here we'll use semicolon. We will execute this. With basic for loop, it will display the numbers as sequentially as 1 to 9, and with parallel for loop, it will not display the numbers sequentially. Now here we will see how thread is working. So I'll comment this, and in console.writeLine we will print thread also. So console.writeLine, first we will display value of I, and we will print I, and then we will print thread. So thread equal to, we will print thread dot current thread dot managed thread. And with parallel for loop also we will print this thread. So I will copy this and I will paste here, and we will use here thread dot sleep for 10 millisecond, and here also we will write here thread dot sleep, and we will execute this. With basic for loop, it will print value of I sequentially from 1 to 9, and thread will be 1, and with parallel for loop, the value of I will be 1357, that is it will print value of I randomly, and thread will be different, that is 1345 65341. This means that with basic for loop, we know the order of the execution, and with parallel for loop, we guarantee that 10 iterations will be done, but the order of the execution is not known. Before executing this program, check whether you have used the system.threading.task class and system.threading class in your program.